Good morning, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Welcome to one of the first sessions of the Paris Peace Forum this morning. We have a packed room and 60 minutes of discussion for a very, very interesting topic, managing AI risk, perspectives from around the world, just in case you weren't sure which room you're in. That's the topic that we'll be discussing this morning. What I propose to do is to go around the table in a very quick succession. I mentioned to you how many minutes we have. We will have our panelists give their opinions on questions I will pose to them in just 3 to 4 minutes, and then we will go to a round of discussion and hopefully get some of your questions in as well. We have a full room. So I am just going to launch into it. I am Elina Noor, Director, Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. You should have a list of all the panelists before you. I encourage you to please look them up. They are distinguished in all their fields, so I will not be spending time introducing them. Perhaps I will lay the background for our discussion very, very briefly before going into questions for our panelists. As many of you know, the potential and AI's attendant risks and harms are becoming very, very prominent to all of us today. How we manage these risks and harms will differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The EU has its own way of doing things. The EU AI Act is a proposal to regulate these risks. In the US, where I am based, there is also now a Bill of Rights for domestic application. And in other parts of the world, such as the one that I come from, Southeast Asia, there is growing awareness about many of these risks through strategies and policy documents that are just being proposed and discussed by governments in Southeast Asia, and I'm sure around the world. The purpose of this panel is to explore some of the convergences and divergences of these approaches around the world. And so perhaps I will start with you, Karine. As head of OECD.AI, could you outline for us why it matters to have even a shared or common understanding of these AI risks? And how far apart are our ideas about these growing risks?
Thank you, Alina, and on behalf of the OECD, I'm delighted to be here today in this really important event where we actually get to meet physically, which is we've lost the habit of. Just maybe a few words of background. Back in May and June 2019, the OECD partner countries and the G20 committed to the OECD AI principles for trustworthy AI, and since then we've been working to help countries to implement these principles. We see a few trends. I'll mention 4 here today pertaining to risk. First is about defining the context, and the starting point here is that different AI applications carry very different risks. So using an e-commerce AI engine to order shoes is really different from using AI to detect cancer in an X-ray. This is why the way we manage AI risk depends on the context. And so to define context and identify risks, we developed a framework to classify AI systems earlier this year with questions like, is the AI using personal data? Is it explainable? Does it use biased data? And we really need a lot of information on these systems to be able to treat different AI systems differently. Secondly, in terms of we need assessing risks. So building on the classification framework, what we've been working on approaches to assess risk in an interoperable way with many national and international experts and stakeholders like NIST in the United States, the National Institute for Standards and Technologies, the European Commission, the Council of Europe, ISO, UNESCO, and others, and also all the others at the national level. And from our perspective, we really see a window of opportunity right now to seek the right regulatory balance between that ensures interoperability, ideally ahead of laws and standards being finalized and enacted, particularly so that we can use the same concepts and terminology and decrease the burden on those who are going to have to implement these frameworks that we're developing. And the common denominator to all of the work and the work streams that are taking place increasingly seems to be about standards, which we'll hear more from Lucila Cieli from the European Commission, as well as Elam Tabassi from NIST. So third, to treat and address risks, legislations and policy instruments are critical, but we also need they need to be accompanied by practical tools and educational approaches. And organizations need tools like tools to remove bias from AI systems, tools to test how secure their systems are against attacks. And we'll hear from Lucila about EU plans moving forward, but it's really hard for individual actors to find the right tools for their needs today. So we've been focusing on building a catalog of tools and metrics for trustworthy AI jointly with NIST and with partners from all stakeholder groups. And what this does is brings together many great initiatives. For example, documentation processes for data and models by large technology players, or UNESCO's AI training program for judges, and many, many others, process tools, technical tools, educational tools. And so we'll launch this catalog of tools and metrics later this year or for the new year, maybe. And then finally, to govern risk, there are many mechanisms, and we'll get into them in more depth during the discussion, but one avenue that we at the OECD in particular find particularly promising in our context is applying an existing legal instrument and its enforcement mechanisms to cover the AI principles and AI specificities. And the instrument I'm talking about is the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for Responsible Business Conduct that could fairly easily and importantly quickly be applied to responsible business conduct for AI systems. And we see this as a potentially very effective way to help operationalize trustworthy AI in companies of all sizes that operate internationally. And because implementing trustworthy AI really requires companies' strong engagement and for them to include AI risk management within their existing risk management frameworks, as opposed to recreating a whole separate structure for trustworthy AI. And then lastly, maybe just to mention in the govern component, another very important focus area that we think deserves a lot of attention is tracking those risks that actually materialize into incidents and harm to people and to planet. So we're developing a framework to report AI incidents and to track those incidents. And the idea here is that every country and organization could use a same core framework or common denominator, so we can begin to understand incident trends and basically avoid one incident, a same AI incident reoccurring in another jurisdictions. And so to support this, we're also building a global AI incidents tracker. So those are some of the key points that I thought important to highlight. Back to you, Elena.
Thank you, Karine. Really important setting of the scene with those very practical recommendations. Gabriela Ramos, maybe I can turn to you. Can you please give some of your views from a policy perspective about the work that's been done with the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI? It was adopted by 193 countries last November, as I understand it. Very impressive. Tell us how you did this. How did you achieve this universal instrument?
This is the one. Thank you so much, Elena, and so nice to be with so many friends. I think that you just gather all my friends around the table, so that's fantastic. Well, let me tell you that I will. Karine was talking like the downstream. I really want to take you to the macro. The issue of what kind of world this digital transformation and these AI applications are delivering. And I guess that this is what worried our member states and what led them to approve this recommendation. because we are not talking about how do you build the systems or don't build the system. That's super important because we need to understand them. We're talking about the outcomes. What are the outcomes that we're seeing? Do we believe that the way that technology is being used is strengthening human rights and human dignity, Peggy? Do we believe that they are contributing to environmental sustainability? Do we believe that they deliver fair outcomes, that they deliver inclusive outcomes? And in a nutshell, we don't. And therefore, this is why we at UNESCO took our mandate to look at the ethics of science and technology to deliver this recommendation that was quite an effort because it was drafted by 24 global experts. Actually, the Tech Envoy was one of those, but representing all the countries, but not only all the countries, all the disciplines, not only the geeks and the engineers, with all due respect, the philosophers, the historians, the lawyers, because we need all of them, because it's really transforming the societies as we live them. And then we believe in the functional equivalence. We are not going to tell countries how to do it. We are going to tell them what to do if things go wrong. And therefore, the definition of the ethical application of this recommendation is actually to strengthen and protect and promote the human rights and human dignity, to be planet-centric, because we always say human-centric. The reality is that we need to also consider the planet. Global South was super important in that perspective because they brought this Ubuntu philosophy that I didn't know. I have been for 20 years at the OECD, so I didn't know the Ubuntu philosophy, which is I exist because you exist, in terms of humans, but also in terms of nature, which is fascinating. But then we move into the core issue, which is how do you ensure the rule of law online? And this is the core. What happens when there is harm? And I think this is one of the most important contributions that the recommendation is doing, to say if there is harm, there should be redressal mechanisms, but it should be accessible. Should be as we have the rule of law online, offline, we need to have it offline. And this calls for very concrete issues that I have to say that I never thought we were going to get. First of all, a different way of govern data. Data, how you own it, how you share it. We know that 2.7 billion, as we were yesterday, 2.7 billion people are not connected from the Global South. 5 countries producing the majority of all these technologies, gathering all the data, and therefore this is core. Do you really own your data as an individual? Are you really protected in terms of how is it used? The transparency is there? Maybe yes, maybe not, but we need to focus on these things. We need to focus because at the end, it's not even the question of whether you are lured into doing things right or manipulated in your cognitive biases. It's also that you have a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises that cannot compete in producing the kind of products that the digital technology is competing. So the governing of data is super important. Banning mass surveillance. We just need to ban mass surveillance. Banning social scoring. Banning the question of, as I said, abusing cognitive bias, micro-profiling. All of these things are super important. Not given legal personality to AI systems, because we all say, oh my God, the robots are coming. Well, no, don't give them legal personality. It's as simple as that. And do it human-centric. But I feel that all of this framing, which was really very well developed, need to be translated into policies. And this is where we are. We have 11 chapters, including gender, environment, health, labor application. And then, because you cannot codify everything, I mean, you've heard Karin just getting to understand the things, you're not going to be controlling every single thing. You need to embed the ethical reflection in the developers. And that's why we are developing this ethical impact assessment. Rachel, you're there, part of the group. And also a readiness assessment, because countries are at a very different level of maturity in terms of participating, benefiting, and developing these technologies. And I think we need to recognize that, because at the center of this recommendation that actually I have to say, I have, after 1 year of being adopted by acclamation by the General Conference, we have 70 countries, 70, that are really moving forward. We're going to have in the Czech Republic the Global Forum on the Ethics of AI, because Europe, the European Commission is supporting us with member states implementation, but also with developing countries. Latin America, the CAF is, I mean, Africa, we have this, the SADC, so it's moving, and we hope that we will be able to share more concrete inputs, but we are looking at how to strengthen the capacities of governments to deliver on this.
Fantastic. And I've read the recommendations. I based some of my work on the recommendations. It's a fantastic piece of document. I commend all of you to read it if you haven't had the chance to. Now let's turn to the US. Vilas and Ilham, maybe I can turn to you in that order. Can you talk to us a little bit about how risk is understood in the United States? We've heard of your respective initiatives. Can you describe what is being done to manage AI risk? Ilham, I see you've negotiated between the both of you, so Ilham and then Vilas.
Yeah, we're trying to see who goes first. So thank you very much for having me here, including me here. And I want to first give a shout out to both Gabriela and Karen for a lot of really good content. So let me talk about the work that we're doing at NIST. First, I say that we all agree that the goal is to cultivating trust in technologies, particularly AI, because of its widespread impact. What we have done at NIST in the past close to 2 years is that we launched an open, transparent, collaborative process to develop a risk management for AI systems in a way that it's flexible, measurable, structured, and outcome-focused. We wanted to be flexible because we wanted to allow for innovation to happen, and we wanted to be measurable because if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. It adopts a rights-preserving approach and putting the protections of the human rights and individual rights at the forefront. So in a way, trying to operationalize values in the very high, value-based high-level document that we had seen in the OECD document or in UNESCO. So it goes from micro and macro, providing hopefully very clear guidance on how to achieve each of them. The importance of the context was mentioned, and in the AI RMF, we talk about AI systems being socio-technical in nature, meaning that they are product of complex human, organization, and technical factors involved in their design, development, and use. So many of the trustworthy AI characteristics, for example, bias, interpretability, transparency, all those are connected to societal dynamics and human values. So that goes into one size does not fit all, that I think Karen also talked about this, but also importance of, particularly for some of us engineers and that have a long-standing view of evaluating only technical matters, change our mindset and think about the socio-technical approach. And while the discussions and conversations about what makes a system trustworthy or what constitutes trust, and that's one of the core questions that we're trying to address in the AI RMF. AI RMF described trustworthy AI as valid and reliable, safe, fair and biases managed, secure and resilient, accountable and transparent, explainable and interpretable, and privacy enhanced. Karine talked about the importance of the interoperable language and lexicon, and with AI RMF, we are trying to bring the community on a shared understanding of what each of these things means, so have a good understanding what to measure so we can move on how to measure. And again, while the discussions about policy and regulations is evolving around the world, we completely agree that a common denominator is a good understanding of what we mean by risk, what we mean by trust and trustworthiness, having an interoperable lexicon to talk about this, but more importantly, know how to measure them and having interoperable tools for measuring them. So good standards, good specifications, clear implementable standards can go a long way on bringing the whole world on making AI systems more trustworthy and equitable. And I want to be respectful of the time. I just end by saying that while we are trying to, in the draft AI RMF that again was developed with a lot of input from the whole community, to provide guidance on how to achieve any of them, the end goal, the ultimate goal is really a culture change, is to make sure that the understanding, communications, and managing risk is a shared responsibility across everybody involved, from design, development, deployment, to even use, but also get everybody to think about, instead of, I'm going to talk about myself 10, 15 years ago, building and training models because we could, and change it to the question that, should we? And think about outcome, think about impact, think about who is impacted by what, and what this technology is going to do for the humanities. And that's what the end goal of the AI RMF, which we're hoping to reach. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilham. Vilas, please.
Thank you, Alina. Good morning, everyone. Karine, Gabriela, Elham, I think 3 leaders that are defining sort of human futures around AI risk. I'm just thrilled to be here with you. For those in the room who don't know the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, we stand to be technology creators at the front lines of vulnerability, to take the capacity to build and deploy new tools out of the private sector and make it a truly democratically accessible public good. We do this at massive scale. We've deployed about $100 million in capital over the last 2 years, with commitments of hundreds of millions of dollars looking forward. I share that with you to give you positionality on the 2 interventions I'd offer today. 1, a narrowing of our discussion, and 2, simultaneously, a broadening of it. First, let me speak to the fact that as we see the deployments of these tools, for us, these conversations become immediately less abstract. We see the effects of AI on populations of subsistence farmers who are using new machine learning to predict when they should plant, when they should harvest, how they should enter markets, in ways that have meaningful effects on their economic livelihoods. We see the use of these tools in conservation efforts to track macro trends, but also to track individual animals and their migration pathways. We see many more applications like this, and what it brings me to when we think about AI risk is that the risk of these technologies to us don't operate any longer at nation scale. They're not abstract conversations about philosophical principles, but about the specific impacts the deployments of these tools are having today on people's political participation, on their abilities to engage with economic opportunity, on their fundamental identity in a digital world. And so it strikes me that as we think about frameworks for AI risk, we have to start from a bottom-up approach to understand how communities are engaging with these tools and how they're experiencing vulnerabilities, both historical, that are accelerated, and new, that are deployed because of access, because of their positionality and how the tools are deployed, and because of the intersectionality of the deployment of those tools against their broader interests. It brings me to my second intervention, quite quickly told in our limited time here, which is a broadening, an understanding that AI risk in so many of the conversations we have are still grounded in a reactive space, an attempt to understand how, in the short term as we see these tools being deployed, where we might ensure that we protect those values of participation, fairness, bias, representation. And yet it strikes me that as we look at the 20 or 30-year future of these technologies, we're looking at something broader than technology risk. We're looking at fundamental transformation of systems of power. I often say that I could care less about the creation of ethical AI. Ethics has no impact on technology itself. Ethics is a human value driven by human action and human systems. I'm interested more in how we create ethical societies enabled by the incredible opportunities of artificial intelligence. As we think about risk frameworks, how do we ask generative questions about what a 30-year future looks like when these tools fundamentally change the ways that we interact with power, with human aspiration and creativity, and with each other? Thank you.
Thank you, Vilas, for reminding us of the humanity of tech. Appreciate that. Lucilla, we're in Europe, and you're from the European Commission. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the European Commission views AI risk?
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. So the European Commission is, I think, the government organization at this moment that has proposed a comprehensive framework for high-risk artificial intelligence applications. And this is not about regulating artificial intelligence as a technology. It's about regulating the development of certain artificial intelligence applications in certain contexts. As also Karine said at the very beginning, it depends on how you apply your technology and in which context you're talking about. So what we have done is that we have introduced a number of rules because we want to be able to make sure that artificial intelligence respects the fundamental rights and the safety standards that we have achieved over the years. So for us, this piece of regulation is not introducing new rights, if you want, but it is a mechanism to make sure that the application of certain artificial intelligence systems really respect our fundamental rights. And so to do that, we have identified some applications that we consider to be high risk on the basis of evidence we have. What we have also introduced is a mechanism to make sure that before these applications are put on the market, they're checked from certain points of view in terms of data quality, in terms of robustness and accuracy, in terms of the information they provide to the user, in terms of the human oversight they actually introduce. And this is a system which we already have in the European Union for safety kind of applications. So it's the same philosophy, it's a so-called CE marking. I bring it up because I think that people are more familiar with the CE marking. And so these are checks that we require that developers make ex ante before they put their systems on the market. And then, of course, we have a sort of market surveillance organizations in case there are incidents afterwards. To be able to facilitate the life of enterprises and companies that develop AI and to make sure that we are actually able to check these requirements, we are working on standards, because a lot of this is actually going to be self-assessment by companies, and therefore the availability of standards is very important, because in the European Union, if you can show that you have followed an agreed standard, then this is sufficient to show compliance with the requirements that we have. So we're working very hard on the standardization part now, and we're about to issue a mandate to the European Standardization Organization. And so we work with many different stakeholders, but I also would like to highlight that we are working, for example, in the context of the Trade and Technology Council, also with NIST, exactly to be able also to have a catalog of tools, of measurements, of instruments we can use, which will have an impact, of course, on the standards that we will develop, and we will make life easier also for companies in other parts of the world. So this is the European approach. I think it's very much in line with the UNESCO recommendation and with the work that is being done by the OECD and other international organizations.
Wonderful, thank you. We've heard the European and the American approaches. We've also heard global approaches. I want to turn to really the majority demographics of the world, what we often refer to as the global south, but increasingly is being reframed to be referred to as the global majority, which I believe Nigad uses. I've heard of the term the majority world because that's what it is in reality. Most of the world lives outside Europe and the United States. So I'd like now to turn our attention to the more global perspective, majority perspective. Rachel, perhaps I can start with you. Can you tell us from the work that you've been doing in Africa, what AI risk is like to people on the continent over there and how it's being represented?
Yeah, thank you ever so much, Elena, and it's an honor to be in conversation with all of you in the room today. So I want to talk about this topic of what is the risk of AI to the African continent, and what is the degree to which the frameworks that we have to regulate AI and AI risks can mitigate the challenges being faced on the continent, because Africa's role in the production, the planetary production of artificial intelligence is not at the end. It's at the beginning. It's in the supply chain. It's in the extraction of raw minerals used to build digital infrastructures and the impacts that has on political stability and gender equality in Central Africa. It's also a testing ground for new technologies. So Cambridge Analytica's technologies were first used in Nigeria. It's a place for data extraction to make the technologies that we use in the West more ethical by training it on data taken from African populations, or using African laborers to moderate content so that those in the West are not exposed to harmful and hurtful content on social media. So these kinds of issues are not captured in frameworks that look at the end result and the outcomes and the issues of bias at a micro level. We need whole of system approaches. So this is where frameworks like the UNESCO recommendations on ethics in AI, which a project that I'm running called the Global Index on Responsible AI is really looking very directly to support, offers something that takes a larger whole of systems approach and can begin to address some of the life cycle issues that we face in Africa. But I think there's major questions around economic risks that are not necessarily factored into human rights-based regulations if we take human rights to be very civil and political rights-based rather than socio-economic rights, community rights, labor rights, children's rights, the rights of future generations. There's all these models to show how artificial intelligence is going to rapidly advance economies around the world, in Asia, in the Americas, in Europe. We have very little data to see what meaningful economic impact and for whom it will have on the African continent. Instead, we have statistics that say that by 2030, 90% of the world's poor will be based on the African continent. So what do we do now proactively? Africa is often seen as this site for reactive decision-making and reactive planning and cooperation. What do we do now at the proactive stage to anticipate these kind of much larger risks to global inequality that AI and digitalization is posing? And of course, we're hoping to work very closely with our partners at UNESCO and at OECD to advance the really important work that's been done and to see implementation on the ground. Thank you, Alina.
Fantastic, Rachel. Thank you. Migad, can I turn to you? You do a lot of work with marginalized communities in the global majority. Tell us how you see things from the work that you do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alina, and thanks to OECD, UNESCO, and EU for doing so much work on AI and ethics. But truth to be told, the discussion so far has been centered in the global north, where immense resources are being put into development and refinement of AI. And when it comes to global majority, that usually people call global south, and I think, as you, Gabrielle, said, the majority of the world is actually disconnected. We are often the recipient of these technologies without having any input when the technologies are being made or designed and trained. And then we are in the difficult situation where either we accept these AI technologies because it lacks the resources and material resources to develop it themselves, or decides that the harm from misapplication will be far too much and chooses to be left behind in what many have called the fourth industrial revolution. And I think it's very important to bring in the actors that are not really being discussed, and they are the elephant in the room. So export of AI technology and knowledge sharing to global majority context is particularly concerning within the security and policing context, where states such as China have been eager to share technologies such as facial recognition software. For policing purposes, which compounds issues related to freedom of expression, right to assembly and privacy, and given the lack of regulatory framework to address AI harms, these technologies will have an outsized impact on activists. And as you, Vilas, mentioned about the communities and marginalized groups and the impact impact of these harms on them. So it's activists, movements, journalists, feminist movements, marginalized communities, women human rights defenders, and the countries in the global north place restrictions on the use of AI for policing purposes. The companies could turn to economies which lack regulation or guardrails. And just very briefly, I would like to mention that so much work has been done, but informed by discussions within a multidisciplinary and international working group with a strong representation from the global majority, composed of 21 experts, assembled by Digital Rights in Society. My friend Jack is sitting here, and with the colleagues of Paris Peace Forum, we actually produced a paper which proposed that AI constitutionalism and a right-based approach should guide the development of high-level international protocols and conventions that will set policy-making standards for AI development and deployment worldwide. And I'll talk more about the 4 recommendations that we have proposed in this paper. Thank you.
Just a self-plug for Initiate, which I'm also a part of. That was also a wonderful piece of work. I also recommend that to you if you haven't had a chance to read it. Maria Paz, you also do important work with your organization, Derechos Digitales. Tell us a bit about how you see things.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. We were also part of the working group, and I was not personally, but my colleague Juan Carlos. So I totally adhere to what that was mentioning about the recommendation. So when we think about risk from the world majority side, and particularly from Latin America, I want to point it out maybe as a summarize, because many of these had been already bring for my colleagues that intervened before, 4 main issues. So the issue about structural inequalities in the global south or majority world, the power imbalances implied in the implementation of artificial intelligence systems, the institutional weakness and shortcomings that are the context of many of the societies in the majority world still, and the lack of transparency and democratic engagement in the deployment of this type of systems. So I want to talk a little bit of each one of these. So the first one related to structural inequalities. One thing that we have to have into consideration, as many of my colleagues have pointed out, is that artificial intelligence are socio-technicals, fundamentally, by nature, as was pointed out by Elham. So we have to understand that in the context of Global South, these technologies, as many others, are arriving in a context of structural inequalities that are pervasive and haven't been confronted through more traditional systems or elements or policies. So there is a fundamental risk that the installation of these technologies enhance the existing inequalities and provide in some way a very enchantful solution and very politically attractive solution in order to present easy way out of many of these inequalities. But the thing is that in the reality, the systems are built on top of the invisibility of many of the vulnerable populations of our societies and used many times for being fed the data that obscures many of these population needs and presence and need to be protected many times by the state and for the action of the other actor of society. So even though there is a very good intention in many of the deployments that we are seeing in the Global South, and particularly I can talk about Latin America, the fundamental conditions in which these technologies arrive defeat these good intentions and require more thorough analysis in terms of evaluation previously to the arising of this implementation of systems. So quickly moving to the power imbalances, many of these issues are also enhanced by the fact that, as my colleague had pointed out, the majority of these technologies are developed in the global north. They are not developed having into consideration the particularities and the data and many elements that are from the global south. And as Rachel was pointed out, although we are increasingly also in Latin America a field of experimentation, and we became very attractive markets for many of the companies that offer this type of solution for training, for extracting data, for training these technologies. We don't see the feedback loop in terms that how that training and that contribution to the improvement of the artificial intelligence system will feed back in real benefit for the populations that are the ones that are providing that valuable data. So here, a final empowering balance that we confront in Latin America, and I think my colleagues from the rest of the world, of majority world will agree, is that we have a really high information imbalance in terms of what is the possibility of the governments or the local users that will implement these technologies have in terms of the ability to assess what will be the outcomes or what could be the risk of these technologies once they are implemented in our region. Again, we are a field of experimentation, and we don't have the tools to really balance this relationship with the providers of this technology. And I am passing here to my third point, which is institutional weakness and shortcoming. Why is this? We have shortcomings in the skills and ability to understand this type of technology still from the side of governments that many times are implementing them, or also more generally from other society actors that are implementing it. We still need more education and more ability to challenge the content and the elements of these technologies. And also we need institutional frameworks that are able to question these technologies. So we have countries in which, in many cases, we don't have even data protection that is strong enough, or authorities able to oversee the compliance of data protection regulation, and we are receiving these technologies. So no question about how we are able to positively interrogate these technologies and make them to fulfill basic needs of transparency and remedy in the case that they cause harm in our society. So finally, I came to my last point, which is transparency and democratic engagement. We have seen from the research that Derechos Digitales have done in 6 different projects of implementation by government of artificial intelligence systems in Latin America, in Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Colombia. We have seen in all these cases that there is a fundamental lack of transparency and democratic engagement in the deployment of the artificial intelligence system. So there is no opportunity for society to participate, for civil society, for organizations, for different groups that are directly impacted by the deployment of this system. They don't have opportunity to know about the possibility of deployment of the system and impact the design and the implementation. So at the end, we are losing a huge opportunity of having a moment in which these technologies are really tailored to the needs and particularities of our society. So any kind of framework that we think, and I take back the point of Naidad with the proposition of a constitutionalism in this, will need to take back the power to the people that's really impacted by the implementation of these technologies and give them the opportunity to be part of the process and input in an early stage in the way in which they will be deployed in the majority world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria Paz. I'm reminded of the maxim, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. And so, Peggy, to avoid that road to hell, how do we avoid those potholes? Is a rights-based approach the right way to go?
Well, yes. Okay. No, thanks so much. Yes, obviously, coming from the UN's Human Rights Office in Geneva, you won't be surprised to hear me say that I do think the human rights framework is a fundamental foundation upon which we can build the types of systems and risk assessments and approaches that have been talked about by all of the previous speakers. The advantage we have, as Gabriela has pointed out with the work that UNESCO has done on ethics and AI, is that we have a global process and global standards and a global foundation that will give us a more solid basis to address the inequities that have been so compellingly pointed out by Maria Paz and Nigat, of looking at the impacts in context, as Karine said, was necessary. So from the human rights standpoint, I really want to point out 5 fundamental areas that we need to look at. The first is around risk assessment and what it means in this context. I want to flag a recent publication by Access Now on human rights risk assessments for AI, just came out, and I think really unpacks these issues in a very helpful way. But the key here is that we are looking at, as has been said, the lack of guardrails, the lack of sufficient integration of context, and needing to make sure that we're looking at all of the different technologies and those that have the substantial risks. So the first point is about the need for this graduated structure of the type that the European Commission has put in. There are instances that are simply unacceptable, and we need to acknowledge that, and we need to make sure we are not using AI in those contexts. And Gabriella pointed out some, and the EU has pointed out others, looking at the use of systems, certain types of systems, for example, in real-time monitoring of protests and other events. So we need to use that graduated structure both to look at the unacceptable risk, but also areas with higher risk, and we need to really invest in those areas and make sure that the standards and approaches that are being used in areas that have a direct impact on people's lives, such as in law enforcement or judicial processing, access to fundamental benefits, those are all areas where we need to make sure we get it right. The second point I want to emphasize is we've heard a lot of reference to the role of standard-setting organizations and standards within this process. We agree that's an important piece, but we also need to acknowledge the extent to which the human rights framework has not been brought into those processes in the way that it needs to be as substantially. This is a mandate actually our office has been given by the Human Rights Council, is to try to bridge some of those gaps, and we're right now engaging in conversations with our next door partners at the ITU and looking to bring it to the European Standards Organization and many others in the future, but really looking at all the different ways we can better bring human rights into standard setting in a way that can make those standards be the tool that we need to use within the AI risk assessment. The third piece is around transparency, and I don't have to say much because Maria Paz has covered it very well. But it's transparency at all levels, obviously. It's transparency about what is being used and how, transparency within algorithmic systems and their availability, but transparency as well in terms of the outcomes and the engagement by governments of how they are going to take on these issues going forward. We're concerned on that basis about potential carve-outs for law enforcement, border control, and other functions, which, as I said, are at the highest risk. Fourth, I was very glad to hear our OECD colleague talk about the human rights due diligence guidance and the necessity of looking at the business role in this and the tools that are already available. I'd bring it also over to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which are very much aligned with the OECD standards. And I do think we need to bring those home on these issues and really dive in, provide practical guidance on how they apply and how they can really help businesses in terms of how they are addressing the risks that we're all seeing here. We have a project in our office called BTech that works with a community of practice of the largest tech-related companies to do that using the UN guiding principles. The fifth point also goes back to something that Karine said at the outset, which is around tracking, which I think is very important. I think we need to acknowledge the extent to which we are not necessarily going to get this right. We need iterative processes that really track and monitor what is happening in these spaces, and then ultimately and importantly, a word we haven't heard enough of in this roundtable is we need to provide remedy. We need to put in place systems that put in place accountability and provide remedy for those that are affected by, potential problems that develop. Just in closing then, I wanted to emphasize that this isn't a theoretical conversation. We are not talking about systems that may or may not be deployed at some point in the future. These are systems that are today being deployed without all of the guardrails and standards that we've talked about here. So they are having an impact on people. There is discrimination that's happening. People's privacy is being affected. People's security is being affected. So it is essential that we move as quickly as possible from these general conversations to enforceable global guidance, such as the Council of Europe's initiative on the Global Convention, the work that UNESCO is doing. But let us move forward to make sure that we actually put in place the concerns and constraints that we've heard about today. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. We're quickly running out of time, but we do have a stellar group of people around this table, and I want to do a quick round robin of responses. Perhaps I'll start with you, Nico.
Well, thanks a lot. I think a lot of great work is happening on AI governance. I want to recognize the work of NIST, of UNESCO, of OECD. When we started 8 years ago on the journey of AI governance, trust me, we could not believe that such a bulldozer of positive, credible, including legally binding instruments such as the one that the EU is putting on the table, or the one that the Council of Europe is putting on the table to draw the red lines. When I take a step back at this point, speaking from the Paris Peace Forum, under the shadow of war, the one area where I have preoccupation is, let's call the elephant in the room, AI in defense. Because the OECD does not have a mandate, because UNESCO does not have a mandate, because even the global partnership does not have a mandate to talk about AI in defense, because the EU is constrained in its mandate, because the Council of Europe cannot address. NATO and others have started, but is it sufficient? No, NATO does not represent the Global South, for example. So moving forward, because there is such a tremendous effort being put to accelerate national security and defense for good reasons, for a lot of good reasons, for a few bad reasons, but also for a lot of good reasons. We need to find a way to touch the most strategic, the most complicated things, because all the things that we have discussed this morning over transparency, accountability, are right, they are true. But when you augment the intensity of what they represent on the shoulders of people under the shadow of war, it becomes all the more dramatic. So that would be my call to action. It won't be easy, but we need to get on that pathway. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. Stephanie, your response.
Awesome. Thank you, Chair, and thanks, everyone. It's lovely to be here today. The one thing that I did look at this morning was the sort of theme of this meeting, and one of the things that was in there was the idea that we need to prevent destructive world polarization. And I think we've heard a lot about interoperability so far from the speakers, and I think that really, for me, is something that has been really important, and so I'm glad that's come out. So the need for international cooperation, which I think Karen did well to sort of start that. But to respond to what the speakers have said, I think Rachel and Vilas did a good job at sort of mentioning the fact, again, that we need to stop thinking about this theoretically, and that AI applications are sort of impacting people on a day-to-day basis. And everything from healthcare to sort of facial recognition technologies, it's very important that we put this into practice. So my reflections are sort of twofold. I want to speak about it in relation to policy and tools, and what I think we need. So from a framework perspective and a policy perspective, something that I think could be added to what the speakers have said is the vertical horizontal approach. So I think as we're thinking about applying, it's really important that we think about the nuances of policy and tools, both from a vertical and a horizontal perspective. The second is the need to ensure that international cooperation allows for jurisdictional nuances, so thinking about what we might need within a specific jurisdiction, but how do we then bring that back to the international level? And I think that that's where Gabriella's work on the UNESCO principles and others are so critical, and work that needs to continue. But from a tools perspective, I want to quickly plug a few projects that we have at the Partnership on AI, which I think build on some of the things we've heard. So first is around documentation and transparency. I just want to echo what everyone has said about the importance of that. And I think the OECD catalog of tools is a good representation of work that needs to continue to be done to sort of map tools for transparency that are happening internationally. The second is safety critical AI. So it's a project that we have, which is really thinking about, it's not just in policy and tools as they are at the end of the cycle. We really need to be thinking about safety and risk at the research stage. And I think that that's something that didn't really come out. How can we go back to the research phase and start thinking ahead to I think Vilas and Rachel also mentioned the ethical societies that can only be done if we think about it right at the outset. So that's something I think that could be brought out more. And then the last is another project on inclusive research and design. And I think we heard from a few speakers about the fact that the folks that are impacted by AI technologies often are left out of the discussion. And I think that more and more there are participatory design and new methodologies that we can use to bring people into the fold. Again, thinking about it at the research stage, but throughout the design sort of process of AI systems. And so, again, a call to action to make sure that that's something that we consider critically.
Thank you, Stephanie. Lourdes, do you have a call to action?
Definitely. I think we're forgetting the role of corporate self-regulation here. It's very important in mitigating risks, and we're talking as if nothing has been done. We need to proliferate best practices, and it is happening. I'll give an example. One company, Sony, has very strict framework for following ethical principles. They say everyone in Sony has to follow it. They implement it in their quality management systems, and it's in their human rights policy. And there are already companies who are looking at remediation. So there are things that are happening on the ground, and we need to make it more concrete to proliferate those best practices. And of course, global standards and regulatory framework is there. But corporate self-regulation is also a very important tool that we must not forget. It's part of our arsenal. Things are happening. Let's learn from that, proliferate those best practices concretely. Thank you.
Thank you, Lourdes. Gree, anything you want to proliferate?
Well, yeah, I've also very much enjoyed listening to all the different initiatives that are taking place, and also very much part of it myself. So I like to put a historical perspective on this, because I actually think one of the things that we have to consider is also how these systems normally evolve. We've always had, the electric power systems, the conversation about standard time, and all the time when we've had this conversation, we've had certain interests embedded in certain power negotiations about how do we evolve these regional, local systems into larger global systems. So in a way, what I also wanted to kind of emphasize is that I see there's nothing new under the sun in terms of how we actually develop these systems. The most important part is just to consider how are the different power dynamics and the interest in, for example, something like risk mitigation. Which risks are we considering when we are making risk mitigation initiatives? Something like the AI Act or the UNESCO recommendation are actually putting a threshold at what is our risk tolerance. And it's very much it's based on, of course, what we call a human-centric approach. I very much like also the planet-centric approach, because it's about the systemic role of human beings in our environment. And in that perspective, the key risk would always be the risk to humans, the risk to the environment. And this is basically what I see, where I see the different initiatives coming together, and which is very much appreciated in that sense. I don't want to take too much time. I understand there's other...
Thank you. Caitlin.
Thanks to everybody, and thanks for Vilas to starting off the feminist analysis that we had that was then continued on, which is to look at power dynamics, which is really what we bring as feminists to the table. I've got to say, I would like us to think about different definitions of risks. The risk is, of course, that the power dynamics that have existed for millennia, continue and are embedded and enshrined at scale. Also, small as high risk. You did bring up defense, but I want to just look at just on the ground, facial recognition systems being used in ads in Thailand in a mall, so that it recognizes me and gives me makeup, and it recognizes a man and gives him electronics, and gender stereotypes are being embedded. That's a risk in a way that is not going to be covered on the AI Act, but we have to look at how these things, recruitment algorithms, the entire hiring funnel, all those things are really playing out. So what we discuss as risk is not only like big guns, but it's also small walks and steps and things. That's one thing. Second thing is standards. Everybody keeps talking about it, so I wouldn't have brought it up, but there is such a thing as the Gender Responsive Standards Initiative. It's been signed by every major standard maker in the world as one of the co-drafters, ISO, ITU, all our friends, CENELAC, unfortunately not NIST at all, but I'm sure it will be, to look at, to make a pledge to look at all the standards that exist and that are upcoming in order to look at the gender dimension that exists in everything from, airline pilots, co-seat to farm machine equipment. Secondly, there is also a standard that we also drafted for the British Standards Institution on digital inclusion that already exists, and it starts to look at the nature of who makes standards, who benefits, and says that the affected communities have to be sitting around the table before anything is designed or certainly deployed, but certainly even before it's designed. So this notion of community should be consulted, should be flipped on its head, is the community should be part of the co-creation. And that's what I'd love to leave everybody with.
Thank you. We are unfortunately already out of time, but I do want to give the final word to Cecily very quickly, please.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Cecilia, and I'm an artist working with artificial intelligence and machine learning to create artworks and interactive experiences that can make humans from all around the world reflect upon, of course, the possibilities, but also the risks that the AI pose upon us. And what I think is extremely important, that we actually succeed in engaging the wider public, the civil society, in the reflections around AI risks. And I think the thing for many people is that these subject matters are so abstract, and then it becomes hard to actually engage in a conversation. And I think that's where art and other experiences can play a vital role, because suddenly you can make these intangible subject matters tangible. You can make an artistic experience where you meet an AI and where you play out the risks and the ethical dilemmas. And suddenly, you have had a personal experience with an AI in a room, maybe also with other people, and then you have a point where you can start a conversation, because I think it is so vital that we actually manage to engage humans from all around the world in these questions, because, if we want to create AI that helps us create a better future, we really need to think about what future do we move into so we can create the technology that can bring us there. So we need to engage more people in the conversation.
Thank you. And on that note, I hope you'll engage with other people in this room. I'm sorry I did not get to questions and answers from the rest of you, but please continue this conversation over coffee and in other rooms. Thank you so much for your patience and your engagement. Let's continue to talk.